Alright, so today we're moving on. So we talked about the basics of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, which basically control everything. And now we're just going to look into some of the hormones and what they do and some of the disorders. So we're going to start off with thyroid. So let's get straight into it. So we've got the thyroid with its epithelial cells, which synthesize the thyroid hormones and rearrange the thyroid follicles filled with colloid, which is this precursor for the thyroid. So we make this thyroid hormone from the tyrosine amino acids, which we talked about, combined with iodine that we get from our diet. So we've got a quick little image here of what it looks like. So the thyroid cells have a distinct look of how it happens, and on the outside you can see the follicle cells, and inside you've got your follicle cavity. So what happens, so we intake iodine, which is very important because it adds to the hormone, adds to the precursor and makes what it is, and the deficiency could release in goiter. And that's because if we have a deficiency in thyroid hormones, that will cause thyroid stimulating hormone to increase to make up for that deposit. That could cause the thyroid to swell. So our thyroid and parathyroid gland are about here. It's like a butterfly shape. So yeah, we've got the thyroid and then the parathyroid is just above it. And so you can see swelling here if there's a deficiency. So we get iodine from diet and then via the bloodstream, and that's moved across the to the follicular cell via this pendrin transporter. Because iodine is negatively charged, it makes the cell negative, so we have this influx of Na sodium positive ions which regulate up the charge, and then when the iodine's used up, we then have this potassium sodium ATPase to balance out the charge again. And so this iodination of tyrosine residues in the correlline occurs, and we've got this thioglobulin. So what happens is this iodine thioglobulin are first in the follicle cell, and then they go into the follicle cavity. So the thioglobulin is kind of the outside, and then you've got the hormones in the middle being formed via the enzyme thyroid peroxidase, the bottom there, and that makes monoiodotyrosine and the diiodotyrosine. And then when the hormones are made, so they're still in that thioglobulin, they enter the cell, and then lyases kind of digest this thioglobulin. So all we're left with is the free hormones, which can then be transported into the blood and then taken around the body via thyroid globulin proteins, or very little could be transported by albumin. Okay, so we've got these hormones. So we've got the T4, which is thyroxine, which is the prohormone, or we can have T3, which is the triiodothyronine. So we've got this T4 thyroxine, and that's the prohormones, and this can then be converted into T3, and that occurs with deiodinase in peripheral tissues, and that's done by the enzyme 5-deiodinase type 2, and that's expressed in the hypothalamus, adipose tissue, and skeletal muscle. And so therefore we find a very much greater concentration of this T4 than T3 hormone. So what happens? So we've got, as we talked about, we've got that 3-stage process that we talked about in the last lecture. So we've got this hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, so HPTA. So firstly, the hypothalamus releases the thyroid releasing hormone. Then we've got in the adenohypophyses, the pituitary releasing thyroid stimulating hormone. And then lastly, the thyroid will release the thyroid hormones, and they can be stored for up to 3 months, the thyroid hormones, so we always have a backup of that. And then the thyroid hormones act by negative feedback onto the thyroid to release less of it, and the pituitary and the hypothalamus in the previous hormones as well. So the target cells for the thyroid, cytoplasmic receptors, surface of mitochondria and the nucleus, and they work to regulate the body. So what do they actually do when they get there? So T4 is seen to help with growth and development, as well as T4 and T3 both help with cardio. T4 and T3 help with cardiovascular systems, such as increasing heart rate, cardiac output, vasodilation, and enhanced blood flow to organs. To do with the central nervous system, both decrease and increase of thyroid hormones can lead to an altered mental state, so that's where we need to keep it in normal levels. And the reproductive system, kind of the normal reproductive behavior and physiology, depend on having essential normal levels of thyroid hormone. And hypothyroidism is associated with infertility, so hypo meaning too little. T3 helps with lipid metabolism and stimulates fat mobilization, leading to increased concentration of fatty acids in the plasma. Also, it works on the carbohydrate metabolism and basically stimulates all aspects of it. So if we look at the disorders now, so with all these hormones, you can either have too little or too much. So hypo or hyper. So the first test you could do simply screening for thyroid function, looking at the thyroid hormones, and if they're okay, then you could look at the thyroid stimulating or the thyroid releasing. So you keep working your way back to see where the problem lies. So some of these disorders, are autoimmune. So you could check for this immunological test through the detection of antibodies, or you can look at serum thyroglobulin. So that's the molecule that helps to create the thyroid hormones, or you can have radioactive iodine uptake and see if the hormones are made and how this iodine moves along. So firstly, we've got hyperthyroidism, so too little. So we've got decreased levels of T4 and T3, and because they're decreased, the pituitary will sense that and therefore increase its production of thyroid stimulating hormone to try and make that for that deficit. So if we've got low levels of T4 and 3, so that should be a 3 there, and TSH, test for thyroid releasing hormones. We've got low T4 and T3, and the pituitary doesn't recognize that and it's still low, then we know the problem's up somewhere further up. So if we look at the symptoms on the right, we've got tiredness, cold intolerance, weight gain, bradycardia, infertility, dementia, and stuff like that. Some of them are quite similar to the hyperstate as well, so just that's where we've got a test for that. Look at the main disease that's associated with that. That's Hashimoto's disease. So this is an autoimmune in which your body attacks the thyroid, causing insufficient secretion. So basically, slowly destroys the gland as you live. It can also be due to pituitary or hypothalamic failure, as we talked about. Could be genetics, so it's autoimmune again. Also treatment for hypothyroidism. So if you've got too much and you're given anti-thyroid drugs, that could cause your levels to fall too low. But it's also, we can test that for heel prick test in babies along with their fetal ketonuria, which we talked about in the urea cycle lecture. So then we've got hyperthyroidism, so too much, increased levels of free thyroid levels, and therefore the pituitary would normally respond by decreasing the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. So we've got this Graves' disease, which is again an autoimmune, in which the thyroid stimulating hormone receptors, antibodies, bind to and stimulate these receptors, leading to an increased secretion. It can also be thyroiditis, so kind of an infection, and that causes the stimulation of the hormone. Also interesting in pregnancy, so you can have kind of a range of symptoms here. So the first 2 to 6 months after giving birth, so postpartum, you can have fatigue, irritability, and heat intolerance. So that's kind of symptoms of hyperthyroidism. But as you move on from 3 to 12 months, you get this low energy, dry skin, cold intolerance, and general aches and pains, which looks more like hyperthyroidism. But then over 1 year, the euthyroid function resumes and you kind of slowly get better, hopefully. So as a kind of reference, we've got these levels here of what a normally would look like. So if you ever get a blood test, you can see what you're looking for. And again, if you look at the Marshall book, it has more case studies and more detail on these diseases. More diseases in general, as I've only mentioned, kind of one main one for each of the states. But yeah, it's really interesting to read about that. So don't forget to check in the description if you were to purchase it, and I've got my link there, or you want to try any of the Amazon free trials or buy any practice questions from me. So yeah, thank you for watching. That was a quick overview of the thyroid. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.